Welcome everyone to the Biocurator working group. I will share my screen for just administrative updates. So we are happy to have Les Biesecker, who is co-chair of the Sequence Variant Interpretation Working Group for ClinGen, to talk to us today about the work of the Linkage and Segregation Subgroup. Announcements from me: we'll have a Biocurator working group summer break. And we will also have the ClinGen summer workshop series this year in place of some of the consortium calls over the summer. And we just recently had a pharmacogenomics session of the summer workshop series, but the next one is about Genome Connect, and that is on July 21st from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern time, and the Zoom link is here. And so with that, I will stop sharing and turn it over to you, Les.
Okay, so let me share my screen. Swap displays. Okay, how does that look, Marina?
Looks good.
Okay, great. So thanks a million for inviting me to do this with you all. I think this may be the first sort of global presentation I've done of this subgroup of the SVI. So I'll be very eager to get some input from you all on what we have done. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to start with the thanks because this has been an absolutely great group of people to work with. Alicia, Stephen, Tina, Heidi, Alejandro Schaefer, who you probably don't know, is a linkage guru from NIH, Brian Schertz, who does segregation and linkage analysis, and Sean Teftigan. So it has been a long effort. I looked into my calendar last night and I dug through, and our first meeting was in August of 2018, and we have been working on this for nearly 5 years of almost monthly meetings because it was hard. It was hard because intrinsically it's a tricky subject, and we encountered a couple of dead ends, and we made a few wrong turns and had to back up and start over. But overall, it was fun, and I think it was productive. And I want to walk through all of that with you today. Okay, so our goals, our approach overall was to be as simple. We want the approach to be as simple as it possibly could be, but it had to be mathematically correct. And of course, this is part of a larger effort across SVI for the recommendations to evolve from what.
Sorry, Les, to interrupt you. It looks like your slides are not advancing.
Oh, really? Okay, we gotta stop sharing. Let me stop. Because they're advancing for me, of course.
Of course.
Okay. Okay. Is sharing stopped now?
No, we still see your screen.
Okay. So let me try here. Thank you for interrupting me. Okay, now is it stopped?
Yeah, now you're stopped.
Okay, let's try it again. Okay, and are you on great group to work with?
Yep.
Okay. All right, so then let's share. All right, and now are you seeing full screen or presenter view?
The presenter view.
Okay, so swap displays. All right, how's that?
Looks the same.
Still presenter view?
Yeah.
How's that?
Still looks the same. We're kind of seeing it with like a little format background section on the side.
Uh-huh. With
And
the slides.
Yeah.
Okay. Usually, well, you know what Well, can you stand that, or should we try and like have me log out of Zoom and log back in?
I mean, I think it's fine as long as it advances. I think that's the problem. We just can't
Yeah,
advance a slide and see.
I'm advancing.
No, it's still on
Okay,
this old
something's
slide.
wrong with our Zoom then. I'm gonna log out of Zoom and come back in.
Okay. Thanks to everyone for chatting that and helping me notice. Hopefully we can get it fixed.
Okay, Marina, I'm getting a message now. Host has disabled participant screen sharing.
Oh. Oh no, you're a co-host now, so you should be good. Are you able to share now?
Hold on, I'm working on it. Oh, PowerPoint crashed. That's interesting.
Always something / everything.
And Marina, also as a backup, I just sent you the PowerPoint.
Yeah, it just came through just in case.
Good. All right, so let's try. Let's cancel that. So if this doesn't work, we'll flip to you being the presenter. Okay, switch to present. All right, okay, what are you seeing now?
Okay, now we're actually seeing presenter mode, so you should be able to swap and hopefully it will be fine. Yep, that looks good.
Okay, advance.
Yep.
Advance.
Yep.
Okay, we're there. All right.
You made it.
Okay, so the approach was supposed to be as simple as possible, but mathematically correct. We were really insistent on that, and that was part of the hard part of this. And this is overall part of a larger effort across ClinGen to evolve the Richards et al. Recommendations from its prior foundation of expert opinion to evidence-based objective data and processes. And segregation, or what I prefer to call linkage, but we're going to call segregation or co-segregation, PP1, excuse me, is a natural for this because it is inherently mathematical. And of course, segregation of alleles is one of the fundamental mathematical biologic bases of genetics. And so it really should fit nicely into this point-based Bayesian adaptation of Richards et al. So our group, when we reset all this after hitting a lot of dead ends, we returned to truly foundational thinking and the most basic principles of Mendel and Bayes, and use a deductive and inductive approach based on real diseases and actual variants, first principles of biology and math, to evaluate segregation and linkage-based thinking, integrating that into the Bayesian framework that we have used to adapt to Richards et al., and make that an intrinsic part of this whole process. And I think, I presented the overall Bayes stuff to this group a couple years back, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I remember that. So just as a refresher, what Bayes' rule fundamentally says is some proposition, something you think could be true, i.e., you think this variant could be pathogenic. That proposition has a probability of being true before you evaluate a piece of evidence, has some probability, which we call the prior probability. And then you have a piece of evidence, and that piece of evidence makes that prior proposition more or less likely to be true based on the evidence being observed. And so if that evidence is considered, you ask yourself the question, does that raise or lower the probability compared to what I thought about it before I had the piece of evidence? So that's really all there is to Bayes. The equation I put down below there, I have it in neon because I think it is rather beautiful, but that's kind of nerdy and most people don't love equations. And so I have the 3 bullets there in English, so that it is readily understandable as to what Bayesian thinking actually is. And of course, you are all doing that every day, dozens or hundreds of times with every piece of evidence you're considering for every variant you're looking at in all these genomes and exomes. So I'll start with our overall high-level approach to what we're doing. And what we have developed is a flow chart, an algorithm, and it starts with something that you might find surprising. It starts with what you know about the number of genes that are associated with the phenotype of the testee. And that is either locus homogeneity or locus heterogeneity. What 2 really fundamental principles in human genetics. And if you know that your testee's trait has the attribute of locus homogeneity, you do one evaluation, which is to basically implement an adaptation of the Richards et al. PP4 specific phenotype criterion. Because of course, what PP4 is about is saying that there is only one gene that is related to this phenotype. So if you have a variant in that gene in a patient with the phenotype, that means something, right? That's a piece of evidence. And then there's some nuances about how many variants are in that gene. And we have implemented overall for this data type an evidence cap of 5 points. Now, this is, for better and worse, expert opinion. That is, the group of us felt that the upper limit of evidence for locus-based evidence about a variant should be 5 points, because that is just shy of the likely pathogenic threshold in the Bayesian system, which is 6 points. Remember, 6 points is likely pathogenic. You start at 0, up to 5 is a VUS, 6 to 9 is likely pathogenic, and 10 or above is pathogenic. And we felt that locus evidence, because it's always indirect and not about a variant specifically, should be capped at just below the likely pathogenic threshold, which is another way of saying you need some other kind of evidence to get you to likely pathogenic beyond locus or gene evidence. Now, if you have locus heterogeneity, that is, there's more than one gene that could be an explanation for your patient's phenotype, you also think about the PP4 criterion, which is interesting, right? This is a difference from how we implemented PP4 in Richards et al., which was supposed to be it only applied when there was one gene, but it actually can work if there's more than one gene, and I'll show you how in a little bit. So you can get some evidence for that. Oh, and by the way, I should say in the upper part of this flow diagram, PP4 we have found was underweighted in a number of scenarios by Richards et al. And so it can be now much stronger than supporting, and you'll see why later. For locus heterogeneity, you can get some evidence of PP4-like evidence, but it's not as strong. And then, because there's more than one locus that could be involved, you use segregation, the old PP1, BS1 points, to assign additional evidence for or against the pathogenicity of the variant. You can look at segregation evidence from other cases, i.e. the literature, or if you have in your lab archive and history information, you have segregation data on that exact variant from other families, you can add that together. Then again, you have to do some apportioning of evidence across the allele if there's more than one variant on the allele. And again, it caps at 5 points, and then you can evaluate all the other kinds of evidence. So this is the high level approach. And now I'll show you how it actually works. Now, we started with a real disease example, and we started with autosomal recessive inheritance, which is interesting. All the previous papers on segregation for variant classification have focused exclusively on autosomal dominant inheritance. And recessive is actually important, interesting, and teaches you different things, which is why we started with that. So CTNS related cystinosis, because of course we use dyadic disease descriptors for our conditions, right? So it's CTNS related cystinosis is the ClinGen preferred designation for this disorder. And if you pull up in the literature, the publications on this gene and disease, you will find that 96% of patients who have the typical cystinosis phenotype are found to have 2 variants in that gene. And critically, no patient with typical cystinosis has ever been reported with a variant, causative variant for that phenotype in any gene other than CTNS. So that is a clear and pure example of locus homogeneity. Okay, so that's the example. And I put in here 2 variants that are real variants. These are not pathogenic variants. And please, this is not evidence for the pathogenicity of these variants in these hypothetical examples I'm making up. So don't use this, please, to classify these variants if you should ever come across them. Okay, so here is a family then that has 3, unfortunate family who has 3 affected children with cystinosis, and all 3 children are compound heterozygotes for the 2 variants that the parents are heterozygotes for. And so the question is, does this family provide segregation evidence for the pathogenicity of this variant? Does anyone want to suggest that it does? Should you use that evidence to classify this variant? The answer is no. And the reason that it is no is counterintuitive, but as soon as you think about it this way, you'll say, of course, that's true. And the reason why it's no is because you already knew that CTNS is the only locus associated with that phenotype. So if the patient has that phenotype, every variant on a CTNS allele in a family like this must perfectly segregate with the phenotype by definition. Therefore, what that means is that segregation evidence can only support the pathogenicity of a variant for phenotypes if they have the attribute of locus heterogeneity. And the subsidiary deduction is that the specific locus evidence criterion, our old friend PP4, and the segregation criteria, PP1 and BS4, are not independent criteria, and you have to think about them together. If you did use the segregation data, and in fact, of course, in that family I showed you with the 3 affected kids, it was segregating perfectly. If you used the segregation evidence from that family, you're effectively double counting a piece of evidence, which is the locus homogeneity PP4 criterion. You're counting twice. And we all know that you can't do that in variant classification. That's a double counting of evidence. Now, what's interesting is that the second subsidiary deduction is that the PP4 criterion, as I hinted at earlier, is underweighted for some scenarios, right? Because if it's 96% of cases, there's two variants. You find two variants in trans in a person with typical cystinosis, it's much more than supportive evidence that those two variants are causing that phenotype in that individual, and those are in fact pathogenic. So what we need to figure out is, okay, how much evidence should it comport to? Okay. The answer to that is that diagnostic yield is the answer to the question. So if you have access to a study, or if your lab has a huge number of cases where you can generate these data yourself, if the diagnostic yield for this disease, let's say cystinosis, is 96% and there's no other loci, that means it is essentially certain that a variant or variants on each of those alleles is 96% likely to be the cause of the phenotype. 96% likely to be pathogenic, which is a heck of a lot stronger than supporting evidence. Remember that if you only had one piece of supporting evidence about such a variant, that would lead you to a Bayesian point total of by old PP4 of exactly 1, which is a low VUS. That's wrong for this case. It's much higher than that. It's 96%. That evidence alone essentially makes those pathogenic, hypothetically. So how do you calculate this? Well, nobody likes to do math, so we just created a table that allows you to do this. And so this table is in this draft paper, and it's derived from the Bayesian points paper calculations from the paper that Sean and we wrote earlier on how you do the Bayesian point system. And what you can use is that's the same math from that paper. And instead, what we're looking at here is what's the diagnostic yield. And so the diagnostic yield is 96%, I told you. And so you look at this table, and cystinosis was 96%. And each variant, because remember the effect is we're compound hets, each variant is, you look at the table and find where is 96% lie. Lies between these two values of 7 and 7.5 points. And notice here we're using half points, which is interesting. We can talk about that later. You always go estimate on the low side. So 95% is below 96. You don't ever go above. So each variant, based on just observing it in a patient with typical cystinosis, is awarded 7 points. But as I said earlier, for this group of evidence, we're capping it at 5. We do not use segregation evidence, and therefore you are now done with PP4, PS1, and BS4 for these two variants for your variant classification. Now, what about the wrinkle? And this happens not infrequently. Remember, this is fundamentally gene or locus information. We're saying CTNS is the gene, therefore the variants in the gene are associated with the phenotype. That means that all the variants in the gene are associated with the phenotype. What happens if an allele has 2 variants on it? Well, you can actually do that in a pretty straightforward manner. I told you that it was a 96% yield, and a single variant allele would be awarded 7 points, right? So for a 2 variant allele, what you can do is simply divide the likelihood, that 96% yield likelihood, by 2, and you get 48%. And you look at your table, because if the allele is 90% likely, 96% likely to be causative, that means there's an equal probability that the 2 variants on the allele are causative. It's either one or the other. And admittedly, we are excluding the possibility of the rare scenario where the pathogenic allele requires the presence of more than 1 variant. We're not considering that. It's a very rare phenomenon, and we don't think it's common enough to worry about yet. So we can just divide it by 2, and say each variant on that allele that has two variants is 48% likely to be the cause of the phenotype. You look at your table and 48% lies between 41.5 and 50.6. So from that table, each of those two variants gets 2.5 points. Each of the two variants on that allele. The variant on the other allele, because there was only one variant on the other allele, still gets 7 points. And that is your PP4 evidence for that allele that has the two variants on it, from the evidence for each variant. And an important note is you don't divide the points in half. You divide the percent yield in half and look up the points. Mathematically, it doesn't work right, because dividing the points violates the actual exponential nature of the data. So look up the percent, go back to the table, get your points. So that's what you got here. Okay, then you say you're looking at these two variants and you say, well, for goodness sake, one of these two variants is a crummy candidate for pathogenicity because it also meets criterion BS1, that is, it is more frequent than expected for the disease and has a very low Revel score. The other variant is absent in NOMAD, but has a Revel score of 0.95. Now, I won't get into the math of it. It's a little detailed. It's in the paper. But what you can then do in your head or on a piece of scratch paper is you can kind of work out from that what is the relative likelihood of those two variants. Remember, this is one allele with two variants on it, and you're trying to decide which of the two variants on that CTNS allele is likely to be responsible for the phenotype, is likely to be pathogenic. And I would estimate from this evidence that, let's say it's about 10-to-1 in favor of that latter variant. That means that you can ballpark that and say, look, it's about 90% likely that it's the second allele, and it's only about 10% likely that it's the first allele. And so the latter one is 90% likely. You look up 90%, right, which is 5.5 points. And the 10% isn't even on the table, it gets a 0. So you end up with the former, this latter allele, the one that has the absent and nomad and present and has a high Revel score of getting 90% likely. Oh, I looked that up wrong. 90% likely is 9 points, pardon me, because that's between 99.2 and 98.8. It's 9 points. But of course, we cap it at 5. So that one gets 5, the other one gets 0. Okay, so the bottom line is you only use the locus homogeneity PP4 points approach, that upper branch of the general algorithm that I showed you, when you have a robust estimate of the diagnostic yield from the literature or your lab data. Don't guess at these, don't ballpark this, don't say, oh, it's got to be at least 75%. You really should have a robust estimate to use that, because again, if you don't use the locus homogeneity PP4 points, you can still use segregation. And so be careful. Don't make the mistake of overestimating that PP4. And I can tell you from some of our VSEP work, people tend to overestimate the application of PP4. You also need to be sure that your test methodology is equal to or better than the literature, right? If the literature diagnostic yield, let's say, is based on sequencing and CNV assays, and you're just doing sequencing, you can't use their diagnostic yield because you're not doing CNV testing. So your methodology has to be equal to or better than that was used in the literature or the data set that you're invoking to use that criterion. And the third one is the testee has to have exactly, or at least preferably and better, more than the phenotype that the yield estimate is based on. And this, we recognize this is going to be a hard one. and it's hard because test requisitions are rarely complete in describing what's going on with the patient. And so you're frequently at a loss. In that case, don't do it. It's tempting to wriggle out of this and say, oh, he's got to have all these other manifestations. I can't believe he would just have blah, blah, blah. You know, if you have a syndrome like cough and serous, ARID 1B variant, and all you know is the patient has intellectual disability and your diagnostic yield is based on kids with full-blown cough and serous, and all you know about is intellectual disability, you can't use that diagnostic yield for the PP4 evidence for your patient. If in doubt, don't use it. Okay. I'm going to stop there with the PP4 evidence. Do people have questions about that?
I was just curious, Les, if you could suggest, I know in some of my VSEPs that we weight case counts based on phenotypic specificity. So what is your suggestion for that? So for example, for congenital myopathies, we will give more points for PS4, for example, if there is a biopsy with staining versus an infant with hypotonia. Towards PS4. So how do you reconcile that? Should we just be doing pure case counting and not factoring in phenotypic specificity? Because that would essentially be double counting. I know it's like the case versus the locus, but I know a lot of it is connected.
Great question. So the relationship of PS4 case counting to PP4 phenotype specificity, those are two separate criteria. For PP4, you can use your testee, or in fact, you can use a case from the literature, but you only use PP4 once for your variant, and you can use it based on the best case that you have. PS4 is for counting how many cases have been observed with this variant. And as you said, Marina, of course, you're always going to have a spectrum of phenotypic specificity with those cases. And for case counting, what you described is absolutely appropriate, because what you're doing is you're saying, I have more confidence that this is a legitimate case of this phenotype, specific and legitimate case, the more clinical evidence I have, the more manifestations the patient has. And so you can use similar criteria, but using it for PP4, you use it in one way, and using it for PS4, you use it in another way. Does that make sense? And does that answer your question?
Yes, I think so. Thanks.
Yeah. So you have one case, your best case, let's say, is, from a beautiful Nature Genetics paper of a classic patient, has every manifestation of the disease and has that variant. That you can use that for your PP4. And then in the supplemental data table, there are 16 other patients. And they have a variety of features, right? You're using those 16 other ones for your PS4 evidence at various levels of confidence based on what they have. You use that one classic case for your PP4. Great question. Any other questions? Okay, so now on to co-segregation or linkage. So for this, we picked the disease Cockayne syndrome. And it's a great example because there are two loci known to contribute it to that phenotype. And pretty much everybody with that phenotype has two variants in either ERCC6 or ERCC8, okay? And importantly, the ERCC6 and ERCC8 are not linked to each other. If any of the candidates, and there are some of these where the two genes for one trait are linked to each other, you can't do this stuff. So stay away, run away, as they say, run away, run away. So, and the diagnostic yield is a little different. It's 70% for ERCC6 and 30% for ERCC8. So, what are we doing here? So overall, now we know we are in the locus heterogeneity pathway, right? So we're going now down the lower pathway. So what we're going to do is look at our phenotype specificity and see if there's evidence that we can use from Cockayne syndrome to give us some PP4-like information. And what I told you was ERCC6 is 70%. And by the way this was done on my hypothetical case is only ERCC6 was sequenced in that family. Okay, that's important. So what do? So if 70% of cases are ERCC6 and your patient, your testee has 2 variants in ERCC6, that's evidence, right? And you look at, and if it's 70% overall, you look at this table, and 70% lies between 68 and 75. So you can actually assign 4 points to ERCC6 based on even just 1 proband with Cockayne syndrome and 2 variants of ERCC6, which is higher, I think, than a lot of people presupposed. PP4, again, we used to be supporting, which was 1 point. This is 4 points, which is strong, but that's what the math shows. Interesting. Okay, so you're starting with 4 points. Now you ask the question, does this family give co-segregation evidence? And the answer to that is yes, because again, it's possible that if you have Cockayne syndrome, it's caused by variants in ERCC8, the other locus. And if it's in ERCC8, it's not as likely that variants, benign variants in ERCC6 would co-segregate, right? That would be less likely. So if you do observe co-segregation in ERCC6, that pushes you yet further towards ERCC6. So you have 2 data, but you're observing co-segregation in ERCC6. And so that is evidence. And the question is, how much evidence? So we made another table because, again, we don't want people to have to do math. You can just look up on this table what you have. So with this trait, for this pedigree and recessive inheritance, you are basically setting phase, as we do in linkage, which means you are saying that it is the variance, not the allele without the variance, that is causing the trait in this child. And you have an additional, a second affected child who also has the variance, is homozygous. And because it's homozygous, you get 2 Bayes points, which is our old equivalent of moderate evidence, for observing that second kiddo with the same phenotype and the 2 variants. If that family, on the other hand, was a compound het family, then you're dividing the evidence in half. You only have 1 meiosis for each variant. Remember that, of course, in a recessive affected case, you're observing 2 meioses, right? Because you have to get the correct meiosis from the mom and the correct meiosis from the dad, meiotic segregation, to give the kid that allele. And so there's 2 in a homozygote, there's 1 for each in a compound het, right? So that's simple, just divide them in 2. All right, so then you just sum the evidence. Our PP4 evidence was 4. Because it's a homozygote, the co-segregation evidence is +2, which would be 6. But again, as we said, we cap it at 5. Now, a second novel concept. This is something that Richards et al. Did not even consider. And in fact, none of the other segregation papers that have purported to provide evidence for variant pathogenicity have realized, which is now the more common scenario. And this is what you would most likely see, both genes being tested at the same time, right? It would be a panel, or it'd be an exome or a genome. You're going to look at both genes for sure for Cockayne syndrome, right? Okay, so here's the results on this hypothetical family. So individual 2-2 is really informative here because she is unaffected by Cockayne syndrome. But if you look, she inherited both of the ERCC8 alleles that her affected brother harbors. So what that means is that in this family, and this is a crucial distinction, in this family, ERCC8 is not the cause of the Cockayne syndrome. So what that means is that since is that negative evidence at one locus confers positive evidence at other loci. Another way of saying that is we've excluded ERCC8 by the sister. That massively increases the likelihood that the cause in the brother is ERCC6. And no prior evidence type has ever taken into account negative evidence at one gene for a trait confers positive evidence at the remaining loci. That makes sense? Negative evidence at one locus, it actually construes positive evidence for the remaining loci. It's an interesting idea. Intuitively, it makes sense. So how do we handle this? So since ERCC8 has now been excluded in this family, you can now recognize that the diagnostic yield for a family with an infant or a child with Cockayne syndrome, for whom ERCC8 has been excluded, the diagnostic yield is essentially 100%, right? Because you've knocked out the 30% of ERCC8. It only can be ERCC6, excuse me, and now it's equivalent to the cystinosis situation, right? So you now have effectively locus homogeneity. And the yield is essentially, it's really, really high in Cockayne syndrome. It's, let's just say, borderline 100%, 99.9%. You look it up on the table, 99.9% will give you 12 points, but of course, we're going to cap it at 5. And since you're capping it at 5 and you only have one variant that you're looking at on ERCC8, there's no point in looking at segregation because you've already capped out. And really, since you have locus homogeneity, effectively in this family, you shouldn't be using linkage in this family anyhow. So you might ask, why do you even consider any point values above 5 for anything? And it does have to do with yield and co-segregation points, because if you have an allele that has several variants on it, you can have evidence for that allele, because remember the evidence we showed for the cystinosis example was when you had 2 variants on one allele, you had to divide the evidence. And when you divide the evidence, it's the evidence points go down really fast. So if you have an allele for which you have really strong evidence, 12 or more points, and even more if you have co-segregation, if you have 2 or even sometimes 3 variants on that allele, you start dividing those probabilities, they collapse fast. And then you can use those higher point values when you start dividing them by 2 or 3 variants. It then allows you to assign some points, even though you've got multiple alleles. So I don't know if you consider this easy. Our goal was as easy as possible or simple as possible. And you might tell me that you don't think this is easy. The paper will, I hope, be published soon. The other thing we decided to do on this is to include a worksheet. And basically what we did is we took I know nobody likes doing their taxes, but the IRS is actually pretty good about doing worksheets. So we created an IRS-like worksheet to say, they ask you a series of questions and you put in the answers to those questions into the worksheet. And then you say, line 1 is this, line 2 is this, you divide line 2 by line 4, gives you line 5 and blah, blah, blah. You work down, and we even included at the end of it, when you add line 7 and line 9, it should be equal to line 6 if you did your arithmetic correctly. And then you have a nice little intrinsic error check to help you walk through these steps. Okay, so caveats and limitations. The first thing to say about this is everything that I've told you has a valid foundation in Mendelian genetics and Bayesian statistics. However, this is still a heuristic. That is a method that is good enough to give you a practical answer in many common simple situations. At the same time, it is not equivalent to a formal linkage or segregation genetic analysis. Most of our testing scenarios, most of our family sizes, SIBSHIP sizes, pedigree complexity that we're evaluating in clinical testing scenarios are pretty darn simple. We rarely get in clinical testing big 3 or 4 or 5 generation families with multiple branches of people with varying combinations of genotyped and ungenotyped and unphenotyped individuals. We usually get things kind of like what I showed you. You have parents and you have 1 or 2 kids, or maybe 3 kids if it's a big family. We're not doing huge complex pedigrees. When you have a huge complex pedigree, don't use this heuristic, use a formal segregation analysis, consult with somebody who actually knows how to do this. And remember always that it's a heuristic. This method, this heuristic, should only be used, you can use it for disorders with incomplete penetrance, in which case you only use the people on the pedigree who are affected. For dominance, obviously, it's much more relevant for dominance. And you must realize that if you do that, you are discarding some data here, and that includes data that could be contradictory, i.e. benign data or pathogenic data. You just have to realize that's what you're doing and think about what you're going to say about that variant in the end, having done that. The method cannot be used at all for disorders that have a significant or substantial phenocopy rate. That is something like, say, colon cancer. You just can't do it. You have to, you can use the PP4 heuristic, like you can say for colon cancer, I have X number of genes and I don't know, what is it, 40% of them are MSH2 or whatever. You can use that, but when you can't use it for segregation because phenocopies won't work with this heuristic. A lot of people in these families, not a lot of people, but people in these families can have colon cancer for reasons other than having the familial Lynch syndrome variant. That we know that's true. And this heuristic doesn't account for that. You have to use formal segregation analysis. And again, as I said earlier, if you're unsure of that diagnostic yield evidence, if you're unsure of the affection status of family members, either don't use the evidence or be very narrow in how you think about it and say, I'm only going to use my lower bound of what I'm confident about because I don't want to make the error of overestimating the evidence. Okay, so that, in simple terms, is our new segregation approach. I would be eager to take any questions or provide some clarifications on that. There's other factors going on here. Be happy to discuss some of those nuances if you want.
Thank you so much, Les. That's given us a lot to think about. While people are mulling that over, I have another question for you.
Yeah.
So when we were developing the semi-quantitative gene curation framework, we decided to differentiate, because you're implicating a gene in disease, the type of testing that was done. If, you know, it was candidate gene sequencing versus all the genes in the linkage region or exome genome. Did you consider that or put some sort of caveat that there needs to be a decent link between the gene and the disease relationship to use this framework?
Oh, yeah. So this is part of the general framework where, if I remember correctly, it's only used for genes where the gene disease validity is, remind me, I think it's at least moderate, right? Mm-hmm. For lower than moderate, you shouldn't be doing any of this stuff. Yeah. And in the new recommendations, we have a table we're creating that we are capping evidence, the call of the variant P, LP, and high VUS related to the gene disease validity rating. So we're going to, no matter what the evidence type is, if there is a less than confident gene disease validity, we're capping the entire process at a lower assertion.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have any questions? Feel free to chat them or unmute.
Okay, question from Andrea. Are PP1 and PP4 capped at 5 each or together? Great question, Andrea. It's the combination of PP1 and PP4 that's capped at 5, because again, they are effectively the same evidence. That's what's so interesting about this, right? The specific phenotype criterion is telling you the same thing that an infinite amount of segregation data is telling you, i.e., it's telling you that this is the gene that's causing the trait in this scenario. And so those two kinds of evidence are in fact the same kind of evidence. So it's the combination of those two kinds of evidence, both telling you it's this gene, not necessarily that it's any particular variant in that gene. So that's why we think it's the combination that should be capped at +5. And again, it's capped at +5 to keep it just below LP, so that you should have something else to push you over, which could be, if it's a missense variant, it could be a good Ravel score. That would be all you would need to get to LP. So if you had some of this kind of evidence I talked about today and a decent Ravel score, you're at LP. Does that answer your question, Andrew? Great.
Any other questions?
Okay. Oh. Nikita says, what is a formal segregation linkage analysis? Yeah. So there are a number of software packages that do this. These programs, these software packages are hard to use. They have really rigorous and strict and somewhat complicated data input requirements and the computer running requirements, etc. I don't even do them. People like Brian Schertz and Alejandro Schaefer in our subcommittee do them. And so that's a population genetics, linkage analysis, expert program. And if you want to do those, you need to collaborate or incorporate expertise of a person like that into your variant classification program. We are actually proposing that this approach replace Jarvik and Browning. Jarvik and Nikita asked about that they're using Jarvik and Browning. That was one of the studies that we think made a couple of errors. Number one, they never considered recessive, which is really different than dominant. Number two, they did not consider the fact that negative evidence at one locus confers positive evidence at another locus. Number three, they did not approach how to deal with more than one variant on an allele. And there was one other one they did not do. Oh, they did not recognize that you can't use it if there's locus homogeneity. So we've tried to correct all of those problems with this approach. And that approach is not a full likelihood linkage segregation analysis either. It's a different heuristic. And our argument is that ours refers to, deals with some of the problems that theirs didn't. Any other questions? Those are great questions.
Okay, if not, thank you so much for presenting to us, Les. This was really, really interesting. And just to remind everyone, like I said in the announcements at the beginning, we are now adjourning for the summer. So both calls in July and both calls in August will be canceled for summer break. So I hope everyone has some time to relax and encourage you to join those virtual workshops that we mentioned in place of the consortium call. And thanks again, Les. And
thank you all.
Enjoy
really
the rest of your day, everyone.
Take
Bye
care.
all.
Thank you.